Hello, everyone. So today we're going to be talking about a chapter that's sometimes more difficult for folks. As I said on the main course, this is difficult for everyone, but it's probably particularly difficult for those who either they themselves or someone that they know have been the victims of sexual assault, domestic violence, etc. If this material is difficult for you in some way, I really encourage you to speak with your professor and just share what you're going through. You don't have to share your entire story, but just that there's some difficulty. And know that there are resources available for you. That being said, let's go ahead and get started. Again, this is a longer chapter, so I'm going to divide this into a couple of smaller bites for lectures. And just a brief reminder that I encourage you to do the activity for this chapter before reviewing this section. So, what is the perception of victims? Well, most individuals feel sympathy towards the victims who have experienced some sort of crime and or violence. Sometimes others blame victims for their plight. And as we'll see in our discussions for this chapter, there are certain crimes where that's more likely than others. One reason for this inclination is the need to believe in a just world. So this is called the just world hypothesis. The idea that if the world we live in is just, then good things happen to good people. So therefore, if bad things happen, that person must be bad in some way. So they must have done something to bring it on to themselves. As you can imagine, this can be very difficult for individuals who internalize that idea and then themselves are victims. In addition, there's something called system justification theory, whereas even if the system in which we live is somehow detrimental to us, we are very likely to essentially not rock the boat. To just sort of go along with things, justify the system that we live in. And again, if something went wrong, it must be my fault because the system is fine. Such reactions really help shape our responses to victims. So if people are responsible for their own suffering, then we feel less obligated to feel empathy for them and even less obligated to get justice for them or help them in any way. Now, in terms of types of victims, so in 2006, there were approximately 25 million criminal victimizations. More than 18.9 million involved property crimes, which is a rate of 160 incidents per 1,000 households. And over 6.1 million were crimes of violence, 25 incidents per 1,000 persons. Acts of racial or religious discrimination also occur with some frequency. So for example, 90% of homosexual men have reported feeling threatened or subjected to verbal abuse, and more than 33% were victims of violence. The numbers are similar for other minority demographics. Recently, many have acknowledged the need to recognize and serve crime victims. For example, since the late 1970s, there is an interdisciplinary field of victimology that has emerged, and you may even be able to take an entire class in victimology. There's increasing availability of services for crime victims, including some sort of compensation for them for their, example, medical costs. There's also an expanded opportunity for victims to participate in the trials of their victimizers. And there's a heightened focus on victims brought about by the field. So there are actually whole academic journals devoted to victimology, for example. Now, in terms of consequences of early victimization, A study in 1989 found that abused or neglected children were significantly more likely than a comparison group to have been arrested for violent crimes later in their life as juveniles or adults. Post-traumatic stress disorder is another possible consequence, especially if the crime is violent or violates that person's bodily integrity in some way. So individuals who suffer severe trauma and later experience intense fear-related reactions when reminded of that trauma may be experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. Now, a lot of people think of PTSD only in the context of people who have been in military combat. However, victims of crimes, victims of car accidents, folks who have had near-death experiences, etc., can all suffer similar consequences, similar symptoms, and meet criteria for PTSD. Now, in terms of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, so you have to have exposure to a traumatic event, actual or threatened death, serious injury, and I really like this is new for the DSM-5, that they specifically put sexual violation because it's almost a separate category. As we talk through sexual assault, you'll see how devastating it is. It truly is one of the most violent crimes you can survive, and there are a lot of issues that surround it. Then you have to have one or more of the following intrusive symptoms. So recurrent, involuntary, and distressing memories, recurrent, distressing dreams, dissociative reactions. These include flashbacks. Flashbacks are when you actually feel like you're back in the traumatic event. So a combat veteran hears a car backfire, and to them, that's shots fired and they'll hit the deck. A sexual assault victim can be having consensual sex with a partner they love. Something triggers it, brings it back, flashback, and they actually now feel like they're being raped again. And just a really quick side note about this, this is where the term triggered, that has a lot of political connotation in our current academic culture, comes from. It is very specific to people who have suffered traumas and might be triggered to have a flashback in PTSD. This is a true psychological symptom these people can experience. They also have significant distress and exposure to anything that's going to remind them of the event, and will even have physiological responses, racing heart, difficulty breathing, things along those lines, to reminders of the event. They will avoid all stimuli associated with the event. This becomes really difficult, as you can imagine, in some scenarios. I had a combat veteran I treated who still worked civil service for the Army, and he had to leave the room every time someone brought up Iraq. You can imagine how difficult that is when you work for the Army. Again, if you're a sexual assault victim and you were sexually assaulted in your dorm room, you might imagine how you would avoid that, leaving college or not going back to your room, avoiding a class you're in because your perpetrator is in the same class. Negative changes in cognition and mood, like the inability to remember important aspects of the event. We're going to talk about that very specifically with sexual assault later in this lecture. Exaggerated negative beliefs about yourself, thinking you are somehow responsible for what happened and you're a horrible person because that happened. So again, that just world hypothesis we just talked about. And persistent negative emotions. It can look like depression, essentially. Marked changes in arousal and reactivity. Hypervigilance is where you're just sort of always on your guard, looking around, checking things out. If you've ever seen a military vet, a lot of law enforcement officials do this too. When they have the choice where they sit at a restaurant or in a room, they will sit with their back to a wall so no one can sneak up on them. If you are able to sneak up on one of these folks, they will have an exaggerated startle response, so they'll jump a mile. A horrible story, one of my colleagues in my residency had a combat vet that his child woke him up from a nap. He didn't know where he was. He had been having a dream, and he grabbed his child by the neck. The child was fine, but they had to sort of teach the child, you can't wake dad up when he's sleeping, until he got treatment. They'll also have sleep disturbance, difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, nightmares. And then clearly significant distress or impairment, and your symptoms have to last more than a month to be diagnosed with PTSD. If it is within that month after the event happened and you have these symptoms, there's a separate diagnosis we can give the person called acute stress disorder. And then once you get past that 1 month mark, you then have PTSD. So some statistics here about PTSD. So lifetime prevalence of at least one traumatic event is 50% for women, 60% for men. About 7 to 9% of the general population does meet criteria for PTSD. And the ratio of women to men is 2 to 1 for those who do have PTSD. So it's about 12% of sample of females lifetime, and then 4.6% currently had it in the study in 1993. And after trauma, 20% of women and 8% of men will develop disorders. Some of that has to do with the type of trauma they're exposed to, which we'll go over in the coming slides. And some of that has to do with women having a greater vulnerability for a whole host of reasons that we don't need to get into here, but related to depression, anxiety, things along those lines. Some events like combat disasters, abuse, and victimization are more likely to cause PTSD than others. So here are some statistics about that. So in general, if you have a trauma, 8 to 10% of people will develop PTSD. In our veterans returning from Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Iraqi Freedom, OEF vets, those are Iraq and Afghanistan vets, 13.5 to 20% of them are showing PTSD. Those who are wounded in combat, 20%. If you've been raped or sexually assaulted, 50% of those people develop PTSD. If you're a prisoner of war, also 50%. So I want to just take a minute and stop and look at that. So rape and sexual assault has the same rate of PTSD as being a prisoner of war. I think that really speaks to the psychological impact of being raped or sexually assaulted. If you had repeated high levels of combat exposure in Vietnam, those people, 60% of them. And women with trauma related to crime, it's 26%. Non-criminal trauma, it's 9%. This is much more likely if they were injured and if they felt their life was in danger and they had no control over the trauma. Note that, as I just said a couple minutes ago, although many people who experience severe trauma may develop that acute stress disorder that's shorter related, most who do get acute stress disorder don't go on to develop full-blown PTSD. Okay, so some people will have these symptoms for about a month or less and are able to find adaptive ways to cope and go on with things. And it has nothing to do with how tough you are, how strong. There's a lot of biological factors and social support factors that are related to that. And that's why social support is actually our next bullet point here. So individuals who do get high levels of social support immediately following the trauma are much less likely to go on to develop PTSD. Individuals who suffer PTSD often perceive the world as dangerous, and they feel like it's a place from which they must retreat, and they come to view themselves as helpless to deal with stressors. Edna Foa has developed a very effective type of therapy to treat PTSD. It's been used in combat vets, but she initially developed it to treat sexual traumas. And it really is designed to attack two misconceptions. The idea that they have to retreat from the world, but also that they are helpless to deal with the stressors that come up. So in this type of therapy, which I actually did while I was on my residency, you have education about the common psychological reactions to that trauma. So a lot of what I'm telling you guys, you would educate that person about. You talk about the just world hypothesis, for example. Training and skills such as relaxation to cope with that stress. Emotionally reliving the trauma through imagery-based exposure methods. So you have the person write their trauma and then say it out loud to you. This helps to take away some of that avoidance and some of the power that trauma has by avoiding it. And it allows them to diffuse their fears of the trauma. And then what's called cognitive restructuring, which helps you replace negative beliefs about your competence and adequacy with more realistic appraisals. And victims who complete this type of therapy have fewer PTSD symptoms than control subjects who did not receive treatment. So now we are going to focus in on rape and sexual assault because this is one of the, again, most traumatic crimes you can survive. Attempted murder is another one that comes to mind. And unfortunately, it's fairly prevalent, which is really sad. So some myths that we'll address and stereotypes about rape and sexual assault. This idea that women can't be raped, that it's just, they could always say no. A politician several years ago said the women's body has a way of shutting that down. No, women can be raped, men can be raped. That's another myth that's not on this list. But men can also be raped by women or by other men. And people who don't identify as a non-binary gender, those who are trans or those who are gender fluid, not only can be raped, but are actually have higher rates of sexual assault than the general population. This idea that women secretly wish to be raped, just no. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about that. No. And then this idea that most accusations of rape are faked. So this is a huge one, I think, because these cases tend to be covered more in the media. But the rate of false responding for sexual assault is 2 to 8%. Just going to let that kind of sink in because that's super low. When I ask students this in an in-person class, they often guess it's like 80%. And also, it's important to note that that 2 to 8% is the same rate of false reporting as any other crime. Again, just going to let that sink in. Field concluded that there are 7 different attitude clusters that contribute to our overall perspective of rape. Among Field's factors is the degree to which women are seen as responsible for preventing their own rape. The idea that you have to know self-defense and you have to fend that person off. The desire for sex is seen as the main motive for rape. Rape is really about power and control, controlling that person, right? If you want to have sex, you have consensual sex, right? And severe punishment is advocated for rapists. And a woman is seen as instigating rape through some sort of flirtatious behavior or provocative dress. Again, to poke holes in this, my residency supervisor said this best, I think. You could walk naked down the street, and you are violating other laws, right? Public decency laws, but you can walk naked down the street, and no one has the right to sexually assault you, just like they don't have any right to murder you or rob you, right, at that point in time. So I think that's something to kind of keep in mind. That doesn't really jive with the mainstream way of talking about sexual assault, right? So what accounts for these stereotypes and myths about rape? So some have an ideology that encourages the acceptance of myth about rape. And this originally came from a study back in 1980 by a guy named Burt. This idea embraces the following beliefs: sexual conservatism, so the idea that we can't talk about sex and sex is dirty in some way, adversarial sexual beliefs, acceptance of interpersonal violence, and sex role stereotyping. So the idea that sex is some sort of battle, interpersonal violence is acceptable in some way, and there are specific gender roles, and if you're not fulfilling them, that's problematic, right? I do have to kind of say really quickly that these are also biased not only towards women, but towards men. One of the sexual stereotypes is the idea that men can't control themselves, so that's why rape happens. Like, that's super insulting to men, right? Like, the idea that you can't control yourself against committing a felony, it's ludicrous, right? Those who are more tolerant of rape or find rape more acceptable are more likely to have traditional beliefs about gender roles, to have more adversarial sexual beliefs, to have a greater need for power and dominance, and have heightened expressions of aggressiveness and anger. So some facts about rape here. The United States has one of the highest rates of forcible rape among the world's industrialized countries. So there's about 75 to 85 forcible rapes reported annually to the police for every 100,000 females. That being said, we know that not everyone who is sexually assaulted actually reports it. So according to the National Violence Against Women survey in 2000, 17.6% of all women said that they had been the victim of rape or attempted rape, and 21.6% of those women said they were younger than 12 years old at the time of their first rape. So 21.6% of those who had been victims. Among rape victims, 31.5% reported being physically injured during their most recent rape. About 18 million women and almost 3 million men in the US have been raped. Women who reported being raped as minors were twice as likely to report being raped as adults. Again, this is about power and control. So the people who are serial rapists will look for people who are psychologically vulnerable and prey upon them. And all ages, social classes, and ethnic groups are vulnerable to rape. Victims younger than 12 account for 15% of those raped, and victims ages 12 to 17 account for an additional 29%. Other surveys report that between 1 and 12% of victims of rape are actually over 50 years of age. According to the National Violence Against Women study, only 19% of the women and 13% of the men who were raped after age 18, so as they were adults, actually reported that rape to the police. So here's how we know that these numbers that we see in the official crime statistics are actually artificially low. So why are these rape reports so low? Well, there's several reasons. So the women or victim, right, because the victim can be non-binary or male, may think that reporting won't help. They may think that they will suffer further embarrassment as the result of reporting. And often they believe law enforcement officers won't believe them. And unfortunately, in the past, we've had some stuff to back this up. So for example, in the neighboring city of Norfolk, Virginia, to where the university is, up until a few years ago, so since 2010, I can't remember the exact year, it was actually a law on the books that if a victim came and reported a sexual assault, you as a police officer should assume that she or he was lying. No other crime has that, right? Mind-boggling. Many victims are also afraid that their attacker will retaliate in some way if charges are made, and these expectations are sometimes fulfilled, especially, again, if they are being victimized when they are young, because that perpetrator is usually a family member or close family friend who has the ability to do so. Now, some reports here for college sexual assault statistics in university. So 20.7% of men reported unwanted sexual contact, 27.5% of women. 95% of these do go unreported. 20 to 25% of women, so either 1 in 5 or 1 in 4 women, will be sexually assaulted during their college careers. 90% of women know their assailant. So this idea that we have that your rapist is going to jump out of the bushes on a dark and stormy night, most of the time is not happening. Normally it's someone you know. 42% of college women who are sexually assaulted tell no one about the assault. And there are 10 times more rapes reported to crisis lines than are reported to police, which again is one of those other statistics that shows us that those general national crime statistics are underestimates. Now, in terms of motivations and characteristics of rapists, experts have developed typologies of rapists, and most typologies have emphasized 4 factors that distinguish different types of rapists. So the amount and type of aggression that the rapists use, when the level of aggression is high, whether it heightened sexual arousal in a sadistic manner, so some people actually get off on aggression, whether the offender showed evidence of psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder, and whether the offender relied on deviant sexual fantasies to produce sexual arousal. So the only way they could get aroused is through these deviant fantasies. Now, in terms of acquaintance rape and date rape, over 3/4 of the rapes committed are committed by acquaintances, by someone that you know. And these are the assaults that women are least likely to report. In one survey, 22% of college females reported being a victim of at least once attempted or completed acquaintance rape. Date rapes tend to occur on weekends between 10 and 1, and they take place at the assailant's home, usually, or the victim's home. Date rapes tend to involve situations in which both the attacker and the victim have been using alcohol or drugs, but they're less likely to involve the use of weapons. Instead, there's verbal threats, physical prowess, or the use of drugs in some way, whether that be the date rape drug, whether that be one of the horrible things I've heard is that sometimes rapists will add Benadryl to things to make their victims groggy. And that doesn't come up on a talk screen. That's not something we'd screen for. What are the effects of sexual assault? Rape victims suffer from physical injuries, emotional pain, and humiliation, and sometimes severe psychological after effects. So they're 3 times more likely to have depression, 6 times more likely to have PTSD, 13 times more likely to abuse alcohol as a way to essentially cope, 26 more likely to abuse drugs, and 4 times more likely to contemplate suicide. So the long-term consequences of rape are also concerning. Fear and anxiety have been found to be significantly higher in the rape victim population compared to the non-abused sample, regardless of the length of time since their rape. Findings have also indicated that rape victims are significantly more depressed than those who've raped, and that fear, anxiety, and depression were highest in those women who had been raped more than once. And as you can imagine, that may translate for college women into even more difficulty. So they can't perform at the same academic levels. They may be unable to carry a normal course load. They'll miss classes more frequently, again, especially if they're going to see their perpetrator on campus. They may withdraw from courses altogether. They may leave the school until they recover, or they may transfer. So in terms of health consequences as well, so 40% of rape survivors develop a sexually transmitted disease or sexually transmitted infection as a result of sexual assault. 80% of rape victims suffer chronic physical or psychological problems over time. 13 times as many rape survivors try to commit suicide than people who are not victims of crime. Rape survivors are 6 times more likely to attempt suicide than victims of other crimes. And 25 to 50% will seek mental health treatment as the result of the assault. Now, in terms of legislation and court decisions, beginning in the 1970s, legislation about rape began to undergo review and revision. So replacing the term rape with sexual assault, reflecting the view that this crime is a expression of violence. Also, rape had a very narrow legal definition, again, until very recently. The FBI definition was forcible entry of penis into vagina. So sexual assault as an umbrella term is going to cover many more things: forced oral sex, forced anal sex, things of digital penetration, things along those lines. So the basic definition of sexual assault is non-consenting sexual contact. Can include intercourse, but other things as well, that is obtained by use of force or coercion against the victim. Until about the 1980s, 4/5 of states still used a resistance standard by their rape definition. Now states do include coercion or intimidation against the alleged assailant by the alleged assailant, in their definition. Many newer laws divide sexual assault into degrees according to the extent or force or threat used, very similar to degrees of murder. And now all states recognize spousal rape. That is unfortunately new. In a university, college, other educational setting, Title IX is what covers this. You may know Title IX, mostly related to sports. But Title IX essentially says you can't discriminate based on sex. And the idea is that if you have been sexually assaulted, sexually harassed in some way, you are being discriminated on based on sex. And then you cannot have an equal educational opportunity as a result. Now, rape victims as witnesses, jurors can be influenced by the testimony about the women's character, reputation, and lifestyle. So if the woman is a virgin or is not, all things that should be pretty irrelevant, right? So states have developed what are called rape shield laws, which are designed to protect victims' rights to privacy during the trial and exclude evidence about past sexual behavior that might influence the jury's decision in the case. It's irrelevant. When you have been robbed, it shouldn't matter how many times you've been robbed in the past, right? Or how many times you've given people money in the past is a better analogy. Now we're going to talk about some of the biologically based things that happen as a result of rape. So these are common things you hear not only from civilians, but also from law enforcement officials about rape victims. They're making it up. No way it's true. No one would act like that. They can't get their story straight. The stuff they say makes no sense. And this comes largely from the work of Rebecca Campbell, who is a psychologist who studies this. So we're going to talk very briefly about the neurobiology of sexual trauma. So what happens to your brain during a sexual assault? I'm not going to get too nitty gritty, but there's a part of your brain called the amygdala that detects threat. And that's going to activate your hypothalamus. And then there's the hypothalamic pituitary axis, or HPA axis. Sorry, it's hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis that kicks in. And there's a hormone flood. So you have hormones that increase that can cause damage to memory and impair rational thought. Opioids increase, that can cause what's called flat affect. So literally, you just will seem sort of dead, flat. You won't be crying necessarily. Kind of numbs you. Corticosteroids decrease. That reduces your energy available and can impair your immune functioning. So your hormones go up, these stress hormones go up, your hippocampus is actually going to be impaired. And your hippocampus is really important in solidifying memory. So then your memories are fragmented because your functioning of your hippocampus is impaired. So your memory activation can become unpredictable and traumatic. So your events of the assault can be recalled accurately, but the presence of drugs or alcohol in your system during the assault may prevent encoding of what's happening, which means there's nothing to retrieve. So in general, the way that your memories are encoded when you're being sexually assaulted is going to be interfered with, but you can still retrieve them if you're careful in how you do so later. But if there's drugs or alcohol in the system, that's going to interfere even more. So if you've been drugged with the date rape drug and you're unconscious, clearly you're not going to be able to remember anything. The best way that I've heard to describe this fragmented memory is if you try to write down what happened to you on Post-it notes that had lost their stick, right? Or you're just watching this lecture. Let's do that. You're watching this lecture and you're trying to take notes on Post-it notes that have lost their stick. And then at the end of the hour, you finish watching the video, I say, stand up. And all your Post-it notes have gone all over. And I say, tell me the lecture in order. Can't find it, right? And this is what happens to your memory during an assault. So the result is that it can be difficult to make and retrieve memories. The story may be fragmented or sketchy, and people might misinterpret this as evasiveness or lying, but it's due to the neurobiology of what happens while you're being assaulted. Because of these experiences, again, you might not react in the way emotionally, behaviorally that we expect a victim. You might not be crying. Instead, you might be numb and detached because of that flood of opioids. Your memory is accurate as long as drugs and alcohol did not interfere, but it's going to take longer than expected to put it together in a way that makes sense to those who've not experienced the trauma. You've got to pick up all those sticky notes and put them in order. So there are different philosophies about rape prevention, and two basic strategies have been emphasized. So training potential victims how best to protect themselves against rape is the biggest one. We often focus on this. Take self-defense classes, carry a rape whistle, carry pepper spray. Here's what you do. Women who did not resist a rape attack were twice as likely to suffer a completed rape as women who tried to protect themselves. So there is something to that. The other way we try to do it is we try to design effective treatment for rapists so they don't repeat their crimes. This can be things like chemical castration, where you will actually essentially neuter the person with chemicals. Problem for me is that both of these are sort of reactionary, right? Both of these kind of say, we know what's going to happen, so what can we do about it? Rather than trying to teach people that assaulting someone else sexually is not acceptable, right? I feel like that's a dialogue that we are missing. And one of the extra videos on YouTube is by a speaker called Jackson Katz, who talks about sort of the role of men and boys and thinking about these topics. The last thing that we'll talk about is sort of a tongue-in-cheek approach to this. This is not to be taken seriously, but it makes you think. So these are the top 10 tips to end rape from a UK organization. And what they've done is taken tips that are given to women to prevent rape and flip them as to what to do as a man not to rape. And one thing I'll just say as a side note is a lot of the language around this is gender to assume the victim is woman, is female. And that is because I believe over 90% of sexual assaults do happen to women. So that's why. But again, we acknowledge that these can happen to men and to non-binary folks as well. So don't put drugs in women's drinks, right? Women are told, don't put your drink down. Someone might drug it. When you see a woman walking by herself, leave her alone. Women are told not to walk by themselves. If you pull over to help a woman whose car is broken down, remember not to rape her. If you're in a lift, that's British for elevator, and a woman gets in, don't rape her. Don't creep into a woman's house through an unlocked door or window. Right? Women are told to check your doors and windows. Don't spring out from her between parked cars. Use the buddy system. Women are always told this, right? Use the buddy system when you go to parties. Look out for your fellow people. If you're not able to stop yourself from assaulting people, ask a friend to stay with you while you're in public. Don't forget, it's not sex with someone who's asleep or conscious. It's rape. Right? That's not sex. That person can't give you consent. This is the one I love. I have a rape whistle that I was given as a college student, and the instructions included this for women. If you think you're being raped, run into the middle of the street and blow your whistle. Again, this has the idea that someone's going to jump out of the bushes rather than, as we've seen, it being an acquaintance often in their home, right? So again, carry a whistle. If you're worried you might assault someone by accident, you can hand it to the person you're with. Don't forget, honesty is the best policy. If you have every intention of having sex later, if the woman you're dating, regardless of how she feels about it, tell her directly. There's every chance you will rape her. If you don't communicate your intention, she may take it as a sign you do not plan to rape her and inadvertently feel safe. This, again, tongue-in-cheek, playing with the idea, like, you've got to tell a man early on if you're not going to want to have sex with him, don't lead him on. Where the women in her mind might be thinking, like, we're just having a conversation, right? Whereas the guy might interpret it. And number 10, just don't rape. So again, I don't mean to at all make light of this, but I think it's important to sort of poke some holes into this dialogue that we have about it. Again, this plays back into the idea that it is the responsibility of the victim not to get raped, right? Which is sort of ludicrous if you think about it. All right, so the next lecture will be about some of the other victim related crimes, including domestic violence and sexual harassment.